Good day, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lilly for the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Carbon Pricing Shaping Carbon Neutral Energy and Transport Systems, Technology Exchange Business Cases. We are grateful to our moderator, Dr. Hans Auer, and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for the panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and type your question. We have allocated time at the end of the webinar to read and answer them. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Hans Auer, Associate Professor in Energy Economics at the Technical University, Austria. Hans, over to you.
Okay, so thank you, Rebecca, for this kind introduction. So I will give a brief introduction into the topic. So I hope you see my screen. So dear participants, today we'd like to talk about carbon pricing and how carbon pricing can help us to decarbonize our energy and transport system. So after my introduction, so my 2 colleagues, Karlo from TU Berlin and Sebastian here at TU Wien, will give a brief presentation to show different kind of modeling results and also modeling upcoming business cases in this context. And afterwards, we are looking very much forward to an interesting discussion together with you. So we all know these kind of figures. So here we see a figure, the status quo in 2014. So this was more or less the empirical basis, finally also having been discussed in Paris and resulted in the Paris Agreement. We see on the one hand modeling of on the one hand the remaining CO2 budget being left and the associated temperature increase until 2100. And we all see we rather should follow the blue lines and not the red lines. So, but what's supposed to be now the status quo in these days? So on the one hand, we still in 2019 reached the all-time high in CO2 emissions. So we simply followed the bold red line. So this is a little bit embarrassing. And even more embarrassing is that recently the IEA conducted a study in 50 countries. And if we really implement all these planned economic recovery measures due to COVID-19, so we'll reach the next all-time high in 2023. And this will also whipping out the pandemic drops we observed last year. So we are still, let's say within 5, 6, 7, 8 years, we are following this red line, resulting more or less in 2.7 to 3 degrees. So this is really embarrassing, and there is the need to do something. And there is already a lot of done in a few regions and countries worldwide. So in this figure, so from a World Bank study, from a recent one, we see carbon taxes and emission trading systems implemented right now in 2021. The implemented measures already, the scheduled measures for implementation, and also those being considered to be implemented soon. So some countries have either trading systems, others have taxes, and also many of the countries here have both. So here we see on the one hand Canada with partly implemented both measures. Europe is starting to do so. We have the ETS system since 15 years, and now we have phase 4. So I'll come back to that a little bit later in the upcoming period until 2030. But also in the US, we see on the West Coast, California, and also a few states in the East Coast. So they are progressing very fast in these days. But we also see that there are many countries doing more or less nothing at all right now, and there are also not really specific CO2 pricing measures planned. So here a little bit more in detail. I just want to show 3, let's say, countries or regions. So on the one hand, on the far right, we have Sweden. So Sweden is interesting because they implemented a carbon tax already in 1991, according to the polluter pay principles. Yeah, it's easy to implement also for, let's say, for end users. And our observation here in Europe is that this had no negative effects on GDP development and so on. But we also must omit that Sweden has, let's say, hydro-nuclear dominated electricity generation system. And we see also those countries nearby Sweden, like Switzerland or also France, Finland. So they might have, of course, better starting positions to implement these kind of taxes. Then on the other hand, on the far left, we see here Poland, who had 90% coal-fired electricity generation until a few years ago. So of course, this is very difficult to adapt, and the countries like Poland, of course, need much more time in the next 10, 20, 30 years to make this transformation of their systems. And on the other hand, we see the European Union, the ETS system, and this is within this gray area here. So this was, let's say, the area of $40 to $80 per ton CO2, which was a recommendation of an expert group of this World Bank study, which should, let's say, more or less be the range of a CO2 pricing in these days or in the near future to go into the right direction. So here we see that at present, so Europe is supposed to be within this range, but my colleagues will then show that this might not be sufficient in the longer term, and that we have to talk about much higher prices. Yeah, so what are the lessons learned in the past? So this is my last slide. So in general, both instruments work, also carbon taxes and emission trading systems. And we also have, of course, in a few countries not dedicated carbon taxes. So these are implicit surcharges and taxes like mineral oil taxes and so on. But in general, of course, these kind of instruments, they work, but at present they do not, they are too low to have some, let's say, incentives to switch technologies substantially. Both have pros and cons, and they are dedicated to different target groups. So trading systems are rather for industries and institutional customers. Taxes are rather for the mass market. But regardless of the system, it's very important the details of the design, the implementation, the monitoring, and then in the course of time also the adjustment mechanisms. It's very important that there is no regulatory risk. So the policy framework must be stable because adaptation needs time, and therefore the actors, they need a long-term planning horizon. And we also need prudence. So we have to take care about the competitiveness of the industries. We have to take care about social aspects of end users and so on. And this is what the upcoming policy framework in Europe is all about. So in the Green Deal and Fit for 55 is more or less the acronym for that. 55 is, let's say, represents many aspects, also the share of renewables and so on. But in this context, it's minus 55% of CO2 emissions compared to 1999 level. And we want to take care to leave no one behind. So neither persons or groups of persons, nor, let's say, regions, geographic regions or countries. But we also have to take care, of course, about the European economy, and therefore at present an extremely controversial aspect is discussed and planned to be implemented also in a few years, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this means that imports from regions outside Europe, that they are penalized, that there are some kind of duties there, and from those countries having less ambitious climate targets. And you can imagine that Russia is not amused with these kind of instruments, because we are importing a lot of gas from Russia, and this is extremely controversial, discussed at present. And then, of course, within Europe, we have to take care about national industries and economies. I already mentioned the historically grown technology and fuel mixes. So Poland has completely another starting point than other countries, for instance, like Sweden or others. And of course, it needs to be implemented socially balanced. And in this context, we also made amendments to the EU ETS system. So it's this webinar now is not about the EU ETS in detail. So therefore, only 1 minute and then I'm done. We are in the next 9 years, so entering phase 4. It started in 2005. We still have the free allocation scheme of allowances, but we now include it to cover several CO2 emissions, also the suppliers for the transport, mobility, and the heating fuel sector. So to cover also, let's say, private mobility and the building sector via suppliers in this trading system in 2025. In addition to those having already been subjected to these trading systems, like the industries themselves, the utility industry and aviation. And there are many incentives there to reduce the emissions, the annual cap of 2.2%, and many instruments to guarantee robustness. For instance, the market stability reserve, also to be reliant or have higher resilience to future shocks and so on. So summing up, so in Europe, the policies, they point into the right direction, but now, of course, we must make it happen in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And in this context, so I want to introduce already my 2 colleagues. So the first presentation will be given by Karlo Hainsch from TU Berlin. So he's not only, let's say, a member of the coal exit research group. So at present, I think they also extended already to gas. So it's in general, let's say, the decarbonization research group in Berlin, and he will talk about the open source energy system model Genesis mod, and what this model tells us what's needed to reach actually carbon neutrality in the energy and transport system. So it's the first speaker, and the second one, Sebastian, will also show with his open source models then later on, so smaller pieces. So how, for instance, hydrogen could be produced based on hydropower. And on the other hand, so if the corresponding CO2 price signals really are shown, let's say on the market, how this also could help us to decarbonize the residential heating sector in urban areas. So that's it from my side. So Karlo, the floor is yours. Please try to show your screen, and I'm looking forward to your presentation on the Genesis modeling results.
Could you give me a quick notice if you could see this, if you can see the slides?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it works. Yeah.
All right, very good. Yes, then thank you for this introduction, Hans, and also from my side, welcome everybody to this webinar, and also specifically to this short talk here, which I'm going to give you. And over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to show you a little bit of results which were computed in the Open Entrance project, which is a project funded by the European Commission, and specifically what the role of Genesis mod, an energy system model, is for those of you who have modeling experience. This will be very low level, though, but for anyone who basically comes from other fields, I will try to give you as much explanation as possible towards the results. And of course, also, since this is the main topic of today's webinar, what the role of carbon prices and also other carbon constraints, which in modeling language can be used or are used, are with respect to these results, and what we can learn from that. Quick introduction. What is the Open Entrance Project? The Open Entrance Project aims basically at providing, developing, disseminating an open and transparent platform, which basically can be used not only by the members of the project consortium itself, but for everyone to take a look at energy system scenarios and pathways, model results, and is also meant to be a hub for uploading and downloading data, and just as a starting point for a discussion on long-term energy scenarios. And at the core of Open Entrance, there stand 4 different pathways, which depict different scenarios for the European energy system. 3 of them aim at a 1.5 degree climate target compatible pathway. And the 4th one is a little bit moderate comparably, still very ambitious, as we will see in the results, which aims as a 2-degree climate target. And within these different scenarios, there is also different ways of carbon constraints being represented. And a couple of ones I'm going to mention here are basically the main ones. There is carbon prices, which is basically just what you imagine, that the production or like the emittance of one unit of emission has a price associated to it. There's annual emission limits. This is especially useful when it comes to depicting policies which reduce or which aim at reducing greenhouse gases by a specific year, by a specific level, as Hans mentioned, the 55%, for example. And there is budgets, which really came into the discussion with the IPCC and the corresponding 1.5 or 2-degree climate target. And just a short introduction here, or like just a short overview of the Open Entrance project. If you want more information, I put down the link here, and the slides will also be uploaded after the webinar. So if you're interested, you can check it out here. But it basically consists of the central platform, which is used by different models. We have Message Globium from the IASA, as well as Genesis Mod, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. And these 2 together compute basically the 4 different pathways, which then are used by a multitude of different case studies, and is meant to serve as a starting point. Now, the global energy system model, Genesis Mod, is an open source energy system model. It's a linear problem, which most of these energy system models are, and it minimizes total costs. That's not too much out of the ordinary here. It has been developed or is developed by the Technical University of Berlin, although we're also basically on the way of having the first publication with Genesis Mod from a different institution. So we are really glad about that. And over the last couple of years, Genesis Mod has been part of multiple projects and case studies. It's generally tailored towards long-term development of national, regional, or global energy system, and less towards, or basically to include all the different sectors, or all different sectors, as well as a large regional scope. There have to be trade-offs when it comes to granularity and degree of detail for like short-term analysis. And the results I'm going to present you today, just so you have an idea of what like the general groundwork of everyone is our European results, where each European country or each EU country is represented as a single node, and then there's a couple of additional ones like the UK, Norway, Switzerland. We included Turkey as well as the Balkan region as an aggregated one from 2015 until 2050. And very important to keep in mind is that only 2015 reflects actual historical values. This has 2 regions. The first one is that the 2020, which is the next period which was calculated in 2020, so there wasn't enough historical data already available, as well as 2020 generally being a very interesting year when it comes to the energy system, which doesn't necessarily serve the purpose of calibration of such a model. And on the right-hand side, you can see how basically a short overview of Genesis Mod is. This is not 100% complete, since this is also a little bit outdated, but generally the different energy sectors, then being the power sector, the industry and the building sector, as well as the transportation sector, they are all being included and calculated in an integrated way, which basically helps tremendously when it comes to identifying interdependencies between the different between the different sectors. Just as an example, if the power sector was to be analyzed as an island, basically, exogenous demand assumptions when it comes to electricity demand from different sectors would have to be taken and then being input as the model, or being put into the model as an assumption. And the general benefit of having an integrated model is that these interdependencies are being accounted for, which is especially helpful when it comes to shared commodities which are limited in some sort of way. And we can see power or electricity as one of these commodities, but for example, also biomass or biogas, which might be more apparent. And also in these pathways, there's different ways of carbon constraints which were implemented. Carbon prices were included, which I'm going to show you in 2 slides. The overall amount of carbon which are being emitted are basically, or orientate on carbon budgets, which are basically in line with the 1.5 or 2 degree climate target, as well as an annual limit. Now, these 4 storylines, they can be shown basically as here on the right-hand side. We developed a new, or a scenario generation process, which instead of having 2 different dimensions now, or relies on 3 different dimensions, and on each one of these axes you can see what the general parameter of the respective axis is. So on one side we have policy exertion, on the other one we have technology novelty or technology development, if you want to call it, and then we have society, smart society, societal development and engagement. And within these, this 3-dimensional space, we allocated 4 different pathways or scenarios, which are called the societal commitment one, the directed transition one, the techno-friendly one. You have a very short description of the respective storylines here on the left-hand side. And all of these 3 basically aim at a 1.5 degree climate target, which also in translation means that they achieve greenhouse gas neutrality by 2040, or by the end of 2040. And then we have the gradual development one, which is a little bit of everything, but not that too much, with a little bit less ambitious climate goal. And the idea here is that greenhouse gas neutrality is achieved by 2050, so 10 years later. Again, more information you can find here on this link, and since it's tedious to type it up now, it will also be, or like you will have this in the slides which are provided later. Now, talking about carbon prices, the carbon price, first thing is, or important, is that the carbon price is an exogenous parameter in the model, meaning that the prices you can see here are given as assumptions or scenario assumptions by the modeler, hence by us, and is not a result of model calculation. First, I want to go into these numbers because they often lead to like questions or sometimes confusion because they're a little bit misleading. Especially when we look at the years 2045 and 2050, we see very high numbers here when it comes to euro per ton CO2 compared to what we have nowadays. Important to know is though that, as I explained the slide before, 3 of the 4 pathways, they represent, or they achieve greenhouse gas neutrality by 2040, meaning that after 2040, so 2045 and 2050, there is no greenhouse gases to, or no carbon which has to be paid. So these prices, which you can see here, are just the extrapolation of the respective curves of the 4 different pathways, but they never have any sort of influence on the model results. But rather the 2040 values for these 3 different pathways have to be taken into account. For the gradual development one, until 2050, it has to be looked at because there are still emissions until 2050. And with that said, basically, right, one more thing which I want to mention is the question of carbon price versus carbon budget. So from a modeler's point of view, the life is very easy because carbon prices and carbon budgets in modeling terms often represent 2 different sides of the same coin. For modeler nerds or modeling nerds in here, you probably are aware or heard that the dual variable of the carbon budget constraints represents the price for the respective region and years which the carbon budget is defined for. But generally, it's the same way of achieving, or it's 2 different ways of achieving the same thing, which is why this price here is being included but no budget. and the result basically points into the same direction. Now, still, if we take these 2040 value here, 40 values here for the 3 different pathways, and then the 4th one for 2050 here, they are still quite high compared to what is definitely agreed upon on political level, but also even depending on what studies you find or read, or it's even comparably high compared to those, which I'm going to allude to in the conclusion as well a little bit. But now a little bit of results. I'm not going to go too far into it, also such that we have enough time for discussion later. So on the left-hand side, we have the electricity generation for this 4 different pathways. And on the right-hand side, we see the annual emissions here. The colors you can see in the bottom, which color represents which pathway. And while the general trend is similar across all 4 pathways, which also generally is good because it means, or it's from a modeling perspective is good because it shows that the results are A, quite robust, and B, also illustrate that there has a lot has to be done. The way of how these graphs develop are quite different. Having the directed transition scenario, which is the only scenario where a CO2 emission limit for 2040 is being implemented, the directed transition scenario being the one where a lot of political action is required because technology development as well as societal attitude doesn't contribute enough, shows that in the intermediate years until 2040, the increase of power generation as well as capacities, which we will see in the next slide, is much higher than the other scenarios. As for example, the techno-friendly scenario, which relies, as the name already suggests, on technology development, gets away with less generation capacities or generation in general, because conversion technologies are more efficient, especially when it comes to hydrogen and other power to X's. As for the emissions, on the other hand, we can see that this high increase in power generation for the gradual development, for the directed transition scenario, leads also to the lowest emissions until 2040. While, as expected, the gradual development scenario, which is the 2-degree scenario, is less ambitious and takes a little bit longer to reach climate or greenhouse gas neutrality. Though interestingly, even in 2045, it almost reaches greenhouse gas neutrality with the carbon prices, which were shown on the previous slide. For hydrogen production, I already mentioned the capacities. The capacities are basically a mirroring picture of the generation capacities. So the same trends can be found here generally. For hydrogen production, it can also be, or it's also apparent that hydrogen is the main reason why in the directed transition scenario, so where less technical development happens and more political enforcement has to provide the so-called, like, let's call it fuel, that hydrogen is the main reason of why the generation capacities explode. And in the end, though, in 2050, we see that 3 of the 4 pathways show very large degrees of hydrogen usage. And this is due to different reasons. In the techno-friendly scenario, this means basically that that the conversion efficiencies are good enough. The societal commitment one, compared to the other scenarios, is not only a decarbonization scenario, but actually 100% renewable scenario. So there is a complete omittance of any carbon capture, transport, storage, whatever, or nuclear power, and therefore relies on more hydrogen. And the gradual development sees less of anything, and therefore needs just more hydrogen to fulfill the energy demands. And now, as a small outlook, especially for our next presentation, I want to show you just one example result for the residential and commercial heating sector. And this is the directed transition pathway again, so a lot of political enforcement. And again, first, maybe we see that in 2040 there are no fossil fuels anymore, and it's basically only electrification and a little bit of biomass. And of course, we can observe this massive decrease of natural gas, which has to happen if basically a carbon constraint, as well as like the greenhouse gas neutrality by 2040, if they want to be or should be achieved. So even though, I mean, it might be debatable whether this year is achievable in reality, or, I mean, I can definitely say we're not on this pathway. And the question is, could we ever get on this pathway, and then how? But it just shows the magnitude of what actually has to happen if we want to comply with any climate targets here. And as concluding remarks, I'm not going to delve too long on this, also because we still will have a question and answer session, just like the basically short reminder, or if you want any more information, you can find it here. There's also a peer review publication written by Hans, me, and other colleagues. And one word with respect to carbon constraints. They usually operate in terms of energy system models in very similar ways, and are a possible way of accelerating or simulating sort of the energy system transition in models. However, what we also find is that carbon prices are very good in basically serving as an initiator for the early transition towards renewable energies, but especially when it comes to the last X% of removing greenhouse gases, carbon prices and other carbon, like especially carbon prices, they have a very hard time. Whereas other measures like efficiency and especially sufficiency measures, which we found have the highest influence on basically everything when it comes to decarbonization, these measures then will or should probably lead the way and have or carry the main load. And yeah, with these final words being said, I think I directly hand over to Sebastian, probably.
Okay, so thank you, Karlo, for your nice presentation. So we now have seen, let's say, the energy system model. So this is some kind of, let's say, energy planning point of view perspective. So I'd like to, the participants, so whenever you have a question, please use just the Q&A functionality and type in your question. So we'll consider them afterwards then in the discussion. So you can do it during the presentation or even afterwards in the discussion. So this is well appreciated. So and now, so we have seen that finally hydrogen in modeling at least solves all our problems, so in energy planning kind of modelings, and Sebastian now will consider the agents involved. So in real life we have market participants, the agents, and the individual objective functions, and we'll see how this works on the one hand. On the other hand, so how, let's say, this kind of price signals 2, 3, 4, 5,000 euros per ton, 500 euros per ton, maybe can help to get rid of gas in 2035 or at least until 2040. So Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hans, for the introduction. I will start sharing screen. So I assume you see the presenter mode.
Yes.
Okay, fine. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon from cloudy Vienna. The next 10 or 15 minutes are dedicated to, let's say, present 2 possible future business cases, depending on the CO2 price development, as we have seen in the results from Karlo and Theo Berlin from the Genesis mod. First we will present the economic viable business case, as Hans said, for the production of green hydrogen from hydropower sources. And here we investigated, let's say, an option for the production that has a high chance to be realized in the next decades, because we see the potential of high full load hours of the production on the production side. And second, also, as Hans said, we will discuss a little bit on the decommissioning of the gas distribution grid of an urban neighborhood, and see how the alternatives can look like in the future to supply, let's say, low temperature heat services at the local level. Okay, as I said, to investigate the conditions of a profitable green hydrogen production, we developed a non-cooperative game between a hydropower plant owner and the transportation firm, and both agents act strategically. So this is very important on the local level to better understand the behavior of the different agents. So on the one hand side, the hydropower plant is the leader in this game and sets the price of green hydrogen. You can see this on the right-hand side figure. The transportation firm is the follower in this game and chooses and has the decision between conventional fuels and green hydrogen to supply its fleet. So we started here a specific or a numerical example for a European case study. So we used the Central Western European wholesale electricity market. And just a side mark here, we presented this study also at the Applied Energy Symposium. So if you're interested in more information about the setup of the non-cooperative game, please check out the video on YouTube. The link is here on the slide. And also the source code of the optimization model is available at GitHub. So the results look like this here. First, we see the results in the current market setting. The hydropower plant owner produces mainly electricity, which is the best option to maximize the profit in this market setting. And you can see here in orange that the hydropower plant owner mainly produces and sells future electricity contracts here in orange. In addition, some parts of the flexible production is sold at the day-ahead market here in green. And you can see that no hydrogen is produced because it's better from an economic perspective for the hydropower plant owner to produce and sell electricity than to produce green hydrogen. And this results, of course, in this provision and the supply of the energy demand for the transportation firm using conventional fuels. And this can be seen here on the right-hand side in gray. What is interesting here is the impact of the CO2 price on the profitability of green hydrogen. This can be seen here in these two slides. On the left-hand side, you can see the behavior and the action of the hydropower plant owner. You can see then up to a CO2 price of almost 245 euros, and no price and no production of green hydrogen is done here. I can see on the right-hand side that up to this CO2 price, the revenues are, as I said, future contract electricity and day-ahead spot market electricity. If the CO2 price reaches 245 euros in this specific case study, we see that the leader in this game, the hydropower plant owner, sets the price for green hydrogen accordingly to the opportunity costs of the conventional fuels, or better to say, to the opportunity costs of the follower in this game, the transportation firm. And this enables the hydropower plant owner to produce hydrogen and also to increase their revenues, as you can see on the right-hand side by the blue bars. And of course, and this is important, and this is indicated here on the left-hand side in the figure by the dashed lines here in green, that this significantly depends on the electricity prices. Here, for example, you can see the impact of the increase of the future contract price depending on the increase of the CO2 price. And of course, if we see an impact of the CO2 price on the future electricity price, this, let's say, intersection point or crossing point shifts to the right, and this means that the profitable production of green hydrogen is only enabled at the higher CO2 price than here in this assumption. The second important aspect, as I said, we investigated hydropower-based green hydrogen production because we see this technology as an option to enable green hydrogen production with a high annual full load hour production hours. So here we can see the impact of the CO2 price on the full load hour production hours. You can see that the current spot market prices here indicated by the green line enables high full load hours. For example, at a price of 200 euro per ton, the infrastructure gains full load hours up to or more than 2,000 hours a year. However, we see also the impact on the CO2 price on the electricity, and thus, if we look, for example, to the yellow line, which means an increase of the future prices according to the increase of the CO2 price, we see here that no profitable green hydrogen production is possible, because we only reach full load hours in the range of 500 hours. So here we can see the impact on the CO2 price, on the electricity price, and thus on the annual full load hour production hours of the green hydrogen production. Okay, and let's come to the second business case here. As Hans also said, we investigated the distribution grid decommissioning at the local level. So the second business case is related to the natural gas phase out of a local urban neighborhood. It's important to say here that this study focused on sustainable alternatives, and also on low temperature heat service needs. This is important because if we here talk about the natural gas phase out, we mean low temperature heat service needs at the local level. We claim at the beginning of this study that the viability of green gas is highly uncertain at the end user device level. This is very important for this study. And we presented here two alternative decarbonization scenarios, namely on the one hand, electricity-based decarbonization, and on the other hand, a centralized network-based heat supply. And the following results in particular focus on the network scenario, which means that we phase out from natural gas, from the natural gas on the local level, and here supply the heat service needs by using the district heating network. And the most important result is illustrated as shown here. We see this figure shows the comparison between the costs of the current state and the network scenario between 2020 and 2050. We assumed here the CO2 price of the 2-point climate target scenario, gradual development scenario. And we can see that we achieve end user cost parity at the multi-apartment level between 2043 and 2046. And as indicated by the green and red text here, the year of parity depends significantly on the decarbonization measures of the district heating network, and here in particular on the feed-in generation mix of the district heating network. Because the cost parity is achieved because we have less specific CO2 emissions in the district heating network or in the district heating energy mix than by using natural gas at the end user level. And this results in a cost parity between 2043 and 2046. And it's very important on this figure that we have a look on the yellow area here in the top right of the figure. And these are the cost savings that can be achieved if we act in 2020 or more or less now, decarbonize the end user devices, and the yellow area can be used, let's say, to support the infrastructure or the connection costs at the multi-apartment level. And these are the savings that can be achieved. Before I come to the conclusion here, this slide shows that this analysis of decommissioning the gas distribution grid is already in practice. Here we see an example of Zurich in Switzerland that achieves or makes it possible to phase out on the district level for 5 or some different districts at the neighborhood level. The important aspect here is to discuss and also mention the stranded assets at the end user level. And the problem of this is solved by compensation payments according to the date of device installation. So here you can see in the right box that, for example, 30% of the investment costs are compensated if the device is, for example, installed in 2007. And this is very important if we talk about the stranded assets at the local or at the end user level, that we have to talk about the remaining value compensation payments and how we fix these issues at the local level. So more or less my last slide, the concluding remarks. We have seen in the two possible business cases that an increasing CO2 price is the key determining parameter and leads to improved competitiveness and expected profitability of business cases studied. In the first study, we saw that a CO2 price in the range of 250 or 300 euro per ton triggers the profitability of green hydrogen production from hydropower sources, of course, in the Central Western European wholesale electricity market. And the second study showed us that possible stranded assets resulting from decommissioning the gas distribution grid must not play a decisive role, especially, and this was showed, for example, by the yellow area, that the trade-off analysis of an investment now is more profitable than if we consider the costs of no action in terms of a CO2 price that is expected and is increased in the next decades. Okay, that's all from my side. Thank you, Hans. Back to you.
Okay, so thank you, Sebastian, for your presentation. So I invite several participants. So whenever I have questions, so please simply raise it in the Q&A section. So for me, one of the main questions is for both of you. So maybe first Karlo and then you, Sebastian. So we more or less see an increasing electrification of the energy system in general in the next 20, 30 years, or electricity generation might double already. So, and how can we manage this? So if on the other hand, then maybe what Sebastian has shown, hydropower producers, or then also, of course, offshore wind with high full load hours, if they start producing hydrogen. So notably hydropower generation. So where does all the electricity come from? So for instance, in Austria, if we, let's say, do not feed into the electricity system anymore. So Karlo, what is your, let's say, thoughts about that? So where does the electricity come from? We need twice the amounts we have right now.
Yeah, sure. So generally, of course, it's 100% true. If like we were to achieve greenhouse gas neutrality anywhere near, electricity generation has to increase a lot, and doubling is probably even a low estimate in some regions. The easy answer, and also the basically always true answer, is renewable energies, and we need a lot of them. Now, which renewable energies? This highly depends, obviously, on the regional particularities of like what are we talking about. You mentioned Austria. Let me raise another country very near you, Switzerland, which are very mountainous countries. Traditionally, onshore wind is not as good in these areas. I don't even want to talk about offshore wind without having any coast. So these are completely different situations than when we're talking, for example, about Norway or other Scandinavian countries, which have a lot of wind resources and or hydropower resources. So the general thing is we need more renewable energies. It generally doesn't matter which one, we just need a lot of them, and way faster than currently planned and being deployed in especially Europe. And then depending on where we are, we need different ones. Now, one other thing also is that it might end up being, or in the future energy system, when we're talking about Europe, what we see in some of our calculations as well is that the import and export pattern for certain countries might shift over the course of the next 20 years. When we're seeing countries like, for example, Germany, which in some of our results shift from a currently energy exporter or electricity exporter, they might become an electricity importer just because they're in the middle of Europe. The wind potentials aren't the best and the solar potentials aren't the best either. It might be more beneficial if it would be possible to import the electricity from other regions in Europe. Now, of course, this requires more regulatory developments, as well as also in the respective regions than the deployments of renewable energies. But this is generally what we can see. Yeah, I would leave it at that.
Okay, so and Sebastian, so in your case, so do you think that so in case we produce hydrogen based on hydropower in 15 years or so, so at corresponding high CO2 price levels, 300, 400, 500, do you also think that then at these price levels, it might be attractive also, let's say, to have economic viability of PV excess generation in summer, and let's say shifting this PV electricity generation into the winter months, so that we might need a lot of PV, of course, building integrated PV, so playing Lego, plug and play. But finally, in summer, we don't need all this kind of PV, and maybe electrochemical batteries might be a dead end in the long term. So at present, so a lot of support and subsidies is claimed for, but maybe in 15 years, this strategy might be rather a dead end. Do you also think that we must be able to shift this PV excess generation into winter?
Yeah, I fully agree. I also see the role of hydrogen specifically in this perspective, to use hydrogen as a seasonal storage. Of course, we can expect that hydrogen will play also a role in the transportation sector, but the main aspect from my perspective will be the role of the seasonal storage. And also to add a comment to Karlo's answer, I think it's also important to think about how we can unburden the electricity sector. For example, as I presented the decommissioning of the gas distribution grid, and then also talked about the district heating network and the role of the district heating network to decarbonize an urban neighborhood, I think it's also very important to think about the options that we have to unburden the electricity sector. Because if we look into the Genesis model results for 2050, for example, in the low temperature heating sector, in the residential heating sector, we do not see the electrification of 100% of the heat demand. We see biomass has an important role. We see some shares of hydrogen also. And this is very important to talk about the options that we have to use, for example, sustainable waste sources, and also biomass, to use this, for example, in district heating networks in the future. So we have to think about the options, how to unburden the electricity sector. I think this is a very important aspect and also needs to be discussed.
Okay, thank you. So another question for me. So Sebastian has shown this nice yellow area, so the trade-off somewhere in 2043 or so, if you decommission gas and so on. Because here he already took into account, let's say, what we say in academia, what are the opportunity cost, or let's say the cost, let's say, and the net present value of the cost, or the difference between doing something or doing nothing. This, of course, always is the problem or the challenge when we scientists or researchers talk to politicians who have, let's say, a perspective of the next few years. So my question is it also possible in Genesis mode to implement some kind of functionality to quantify, let's say, this kind of opportunity cost? So what are, let's say, the cost or the additional cost? So if we don't react right now or in the next couple of years, so what are the trade-offs depending when you finally are able to have this technology exchange rate? So to visualize this, so maybe this could help, let's say, to motivate politicians to react very fast, or faster than right now.
Yeah. So it is already in a way, which I already discussed on, which are basically carbon prices. However, obviously, it's kind of difficult for basically long-term, very aggregated energy system models to include how the opportunity cost for certain actors behave. So we always have to go, or like energy system models always have to go from like the general societal, or like the general, I'm lacking the word anyway. So what for the whole, what is the scope of the energy system model, and what would be the opportunity cost for basically the region, the region and the temporal time would be the energy system model is taking a look at. And if we're going back to the carbon price debate, in basically let me go from a different angle. A lot of energy system models, and I think that might be one of the most difficult one, is that a lot of them are we call it perfect foresight. But in their optimization of 2020 and 2025, in their configuration of the energy system model, the effects of these decisions in 2040 and 2045 are already taken into account. So per definition, no suboptimal option will be chosen in these years, except for if it is enforced by constraints. What we did in previous work, there's also publication on that when it comes to the issue of stranded assets, is that what happens if this perfect foresight doesn't exist anymore? What happens if short-sighted policy decisions are being undertaken? And these, I mean, typical political decisions, I don't want to say that they're thinking from election period to election period, but usually it's more short-term decisions than long-term decisions. And what we found in this work was that there is a significant gap between the results, whether it's a fully integrated perfect foresight calculation, or if everything until 2030 is being optimized under certain conditions, and then in 2030 suddenly a carbon constraint and the carbon budget has to be taken into account. So this would be one possible way which could be included or being taken a look at more intensively, is to take away a little bit of this general optimal approach, going more into certain degrees of simulation without going fully into a simulation.
Oh, okay, yeah, thank you. And another question, so Genesis mod, in terms of referring also to gas decommissioning from Sebastian, what is, let's say, the share of green gases, biofuels in general, synthetic gases, and so on, because you also model not only the energy sectors, but also the transport sector. So does this kind of energy system models, let's say, show significant shares to decarbonize low temperature heat and also the transport sector, or is it something else? Because at present, many people argue still we can replace one by one fossil gas in the residential sector by green gas. And I'm very reluctant that this might be a good strategy.
Yeah, so I would distinguish between two things here. The first one is when talking about green gases is talking about biogas and then also biomass. And there it strongly depends on, especially with biomass, what the assumptions are with respect to development of new biomass, especially third generation biomass. Will it ever become available, or is this too far in the future? Generally, we don't see huge amounts of bio or green gases, if we want to call it like that. And also when it comes to power to X or power to gas technologies, because from the energy system perspective, it is like, I can either use the electricity directly, or I can use several conversion steps with included inefficiencies to produce gases, which then are usually being burned, which again is not as efficient as using electricity directly for heating. So generally, we don't see large degrees of this. There's certain, like in the electricity, it would be peaks. In the heating as well, there are certain conditions where a limited amount of this is being used, also because of the aspects that Sebastian mentioned as hydrogen, but also gases serving as an energy storage compared to electricity, which generally directly has to be used. But generally, we don't see large degrees of this. And then also when it comes to the interdependency between different sectors, we see that the building sector, the residential sector, has a very efficient and cheap way of including different technologies which do not rely on natural gas. When it comes to the purely technological aspects, of course, there is a lot of modernization which has to go into buildings as well, and changing the heating device of a building might not happen from today or to tomorrow, and investment cycles usually are longer than in the transportation sector. But we see that these power to X or power to gases as well as biogases tend to be used predominantly in the industry sector, and then to a little less degree in the residential and the transportation sector, but not to a significant high amount.
Yeah. Okay. So, and Sebastian, so in this context to your gas decommissioning study, so I think we increasingly also must talk about cooling, notably in urban areas. So because we have these extreme periods again, and mortality and so on is already, let's say, to some extent correlated to this extremely hot periods during summertime. So when talking about cooling services, do you think that gas decommissioning, regardless whether it's, let's say, some kind of green or synthetic gas, I don't want to talk about hydrogen in the residential sector, so right now, can the alternatives also help us, for instance, if we have heat densities, corresponding heat densities in urban areas to, or electricity, deliver the cooling services much more cost efficient than gas-based cooling supply, so that we have both heating and cooling with the alternatives you identified?
Yeah, I fully agree with this aspect. I think it's very important if we think about the role, for example, of network-based low temperature heat supply at the urban level. We also have to include the increasing cooling demand. And we also see, and this, we can include this in the slides, and if we upload them, they're referenced in publications. We also see some publications that focus on the joint planning, let's say, of the district heating and district cooling network, and we see that we can increase the profitability of the district heating network, for example, in lower heat density areas, if we also take into account the cooling demand. So the cooling demand can help us to, let's say, enable sustainable alternatives in areas with lower heat densities than today, and trigger the business case, for example, of district heating also in those areas. So if we include the district cooling network, this can help us to provide sustainable alternatives. It's very important. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Okay, so and maybe now let's say the last let's say cluster of questions, also dedicated question from the audience. So again, talking about hydrogen, let's say different scales, but when talking about let's say the overall efficiency of hydrogen systems. So Karlo, so what can be expected in the future, and are these larger systems favorable? We see that already, let's say, pipeline systems are planned also in Germany to the different coasts to import it. When we talk to the steel industry in our areas, they say, okay, we need to import 100% of this hydrogen because we simply can't produce it in the next 15 years. So if we seriously want to decarbonize, so what does Genesis Mod tell us about, let's say, not only the efficiency, but let's say the benefits or the economies of scale of large scale hydrogen production compared to, let's say, to these small scale access studies?
Yeah. So generally, the overall efficiency of hydrogen usage, it depends a little bit on what the end use of hydrogen is meant to. As an example, so the hydrogen production with like having an electrolyzer and basically hydrogen storage and then hydrogen burning in whatever application it might be. We're talking about efficiency somewhere between 20 and 35%. It depends a little bit what the assumptions are. It might obviously go up with technological development. It's not a cycle which is like as mature as others are. So there might be more efficiency improvements or could be expected. If, however, for example, the hydrogen is being used in a fuel cell vehicle, fuel cells generally are of a higher efficiency than burning the hydrogen. With respect to the second part of the question, whether it's like large systems favorable or not, Genesis Mod has a very hard time of depicting economies of scale due to basically its linear nature. It's very difficult. It can be applied. What we see, however, generally though, is that hydrogen is not the one answer to all of our problems that we have in the energy system, just because of like the efficiency issues which happen to it and possible electrification alternative or electric alternatives. In the steel industry, for example, there's different ways of using or of generating steel which do not rely as heavily on hydrogen. Of course, these aren't as mature yet, which is also a reason why we see in our results that the industry part usually is decarbonized a little bit towards the later periods of the modeling period, just because there is a little bit the hope that these technologies become mature then, or more mature. And generally, when we take a look at national case studies, which we didn't in this case here, but we do in others, we usually see that hydrogen is produced wherever, or should be produced wherever the abundant renewable energy is being generated, because it makes more sense to produce it locally and then use it or bring it wherever it has to be. Now, if this is, for example, one might ask, and let's take a country in Germany, just because I'm from there, the idea is we have a lot of offshore wind in the north, and then a lot of our industry centers are either in the western part or the southern part. Is this still a reasonable thing to do, to transport then the hydrogen from north to south? Do we need additional infrastructure for that, or can the existing infrastructure be used for that? There's also a lot of different let's say stakeholders which are involved in there, and they have different interests. But we generally see that hydrogen is to a small degree has to be used for specific areas, but is something which currently will, or there is easier low-hanging fruits which currently should be pursued.
Okay, so this is I think an excellent let's say code word. Sebastian, do you also more or less agree on that let's say hydrogen in the longer term then is used or shall be used where there is the highest, let's say, willingness to pay, and of course where it's most valuable? So you have shown that the transport sector or heavy industries, and that we shall think maybe in the next 10 years, because we have to decarbonize substantially already until 2030, rather about the lower hanging fruits for other end uses. So what are your thoughts about that? So as some kind of, let's say, final statement.
Yeah, just a final statement related to the role of hydrogen. So as I said, I see the role of hydrogen at the first stage in a transition. It helps us to enable the transition, let's say, and to decarbonize the difficult aspects or the difficult sectors, or the hard sectors. And it's very important to see hydrogen as a seasonal storage. So it helps us in the low temperature heat supply, as I said, to shift from the summer to the winter, and also to decarbonize the transportation sector. So these two aspects are important. I think this is the main aspects here for the green hydrogen production. And we see that we need the CO2 price as the main trigger, or the main determining parameter to trigger the business case of hydrogen. We need prices above 250 or 300 euro per ton, then we can talk about the flexible options or the flexibility that can be provided by hydrogen.
Okay, so this I think is an excellent statement. So I thank both of you for the interesting presentation and now the discussions. And I think what we have learned today, that we shall not be scared about the CO2 prices in the future above 100 euro per ton, but we also have learned, so if we accept in the longer term, so 3-4 maximum, let's say 500 euros per ton or so, we finally can make it, and this I think is a very important outcome and message with your kind of quantitative modeling studies, that we get some kind of understanding and feeling, so at which CO2 price levels all these ambitions we hear daily in politics also, and from decision makers about carbon neutrality until 2040 or 2050. And today we finally matched it with quantitative numbers. So a few hundred euros, and at a level of 500. So we are already, let's say, climate neutral. So thanks again to both of you, and thanks to the audience, and also for the questions from the Q&A. And for some concluding remarks, I'd like to give back to Rebecca from the IEA. So thank you.
IAEE wishes to thank Hans Auer and our distinguished panelists for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you're not a member of IAEE, we encourage you to join by visiting www.iaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I now officially close this webinar.